Welcome back, everyone. If this is your first time here, I am so glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet where we slow things down, dim the lights, and travel back through time together. Tonight we are going somewhere I think you're going to find absolutely fascinating and maybe just a little bit disturbing. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath. Because what I am about to tell you is completely historically true, and yet it sounds almost too strange to believe. Here is the question I want you to sit with tonight. What happens to a human being when they have so much money that normal life simply stops making sense? We're not talking about someone who drives a nice car or owns a vacation home. We're talking about wealth so obscene, so untouchable, so utterly disconnected from any practical reality that the only way to feel anything anymore is to do something no ordinary person would ever dream of. What you're about to discover is that history's richest people did not just live differently from the rest of us. They lived in ways that honestly look more like symptoms than choices, and it all starts in Rome. Picture this. It is somewhere around the year 39 AD. The city of Rome is at the height of its power, the greatest empire the Western world had ever known. The streets are loud with merchants and soldiers. The air smells of bread and stone and the faint sweetness of olive oil. And somewhere near the Bay of Baiae, the most expensive resort town on the Italian coastline, a young man named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history as Caligula, is doing something that made even his own senators question his sanity. He is ordering a bridge to be built across the sea. Not a small bridge, not a practical bridge. A floating bridge nearly 2 miles long, stretching from Baiae to the port of Puteoli, lined with dirt and paved like a proper Roman road. And once it was finished, Caligula put on the golden breastplate of Alexander the Great, rode his horse across the water, and declared himself a god who had conquered the ocean. Ancient historians wrote about this. Suetonius described it in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, and Cassius Dio recorded the spectacle in his Roman history. The whole affair reportedly lasted 2 days, with Caligula hosting wild parties on the bridge itself, sleeping out among the torchlight, then staging a mock military triumph over the waves. Now I want to pause here for a moment because I think this story gets misread all the time. People hear Caligula did something crazy, and they roll their eyes and move on. But when you look more carefully, what you actually see is something more interesting than madness. What you see is a man who'd been given absolute power over the known world before he was even 25 years old, and who had absolutely no framework for handling it. Caligula grew up watching his family be systematically destroyed by the Emperor Tiberius. His brothers were killed. His mother was exiled. He survived by being careful, by being quiet, by performing gratitude and submission for years, and then suddenly he was the most powerful person alive. No rules, no consequences, no limits whatsoever. Psychologists today have a term for what happens when someone receives unlimited resources with no structure, no accountability, and no authentic relationships. They call it acquired situational narcissism. The idea is that extreme wealth and power do not just reveal character, they transform it. They strip away the ordinary friction of a life that keeps most of us grounded. When nothing you want is ever denied, the brain stops knowing how to want things in a normal way. And Caligula is in many ways the most vivid example of this in ancient history. But he is far from the only one. Around the same time, Caligula was building his sea bridge. Another Roman was quietly staging a different kind of spectacle, one that was in its own way just as extraordinary. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. You may have heard of him. He was by most historical estimates the wealthiest man in the entire Roman Republic, a man who reportedly owned so much of Rome that his net worth, when adjusted for the scale of the economy at the time, would place him comfortably among the top richest humans who have ever lived. His fortune came largely from buying property that was on fire, quite literally. Crassus maintained a private fire brigade, and when a building burned, his men would show up and simply wait, while the owner, watching their home collapse, agreed to sell at whatever price Crassus offered. Then the fire would be put out. A man who monetized disaster. There is a certain dark genius in it, if you can call it that. But what I find most revealing about Crassus is not how he made his money. It is what he did once he had it. He spent a staggering portion of his wealth on exotic fish, not on eating them, on keeping them. Roman aristocrats of the late Republic became obsessed with building elaborate saltwater fish ponds called piscinae, stocked with rare species they had no intention of eating. Crassus reportedly wept when one of his prize lampreys died. He fed his fish by hand. He gave them names. His contemporaries mocked him for it, but that mockery came from other men who were doing equally peculiar things with their fortunes. Lucullus, the Roman general turned gourmet, whose name we still use today when we call something Lucullan, to mean absurdly lavish, carved a channel through a mountain with iron tools and slave labour, so that seawater could flow into his fish ponds at the right temperature. Cicero, who was not exactly a poor man himself, visited Lucullus's villa and wrote with barely concealed awe that the fish ponds alone had cost more than the building surrounding them. Lucullus also threw banquets that lasted for days. The menu at one recorded dinner included, among dozens of courses, flamingo tongues in a sauce of honey and vinegar sea urchins, roasted in their shells, and dormice fattened on nuts. The dormice being kept in special clay pots called dolia, with little holes for ventilation because even the snacks required architecture. One detail I find almost poetic. Lucullus eventually lost his mind. Historians believe it was some form of dementia in his later years. He would wander his own estate without recognizing where he was confused by the sheer vastness of the paradise he'd built. He had created a world too large for himself to navigate. And then there is the story that perhaps best captures this whole phenomenon, a story so extravagant that historians argued about whether it was true for nearly 2,000 years. Cleopatra and the Pearl. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded it in his Natural History, and it was repeated by several other ancient sources. The story goes like this. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt and lover of Mark Antony, made a bet with him. She wagered that she could host the most expensive dinner in history, a single meal that would cost more than the entire annual treasury of a Roman province. Antony laughed. It was a preposterous claim. Cleopatra smiled, and the next evening she sat across from him at a lavishly decorated table. The servants brought one course after another, all of it magnificent, all of it expensive, but nothing that seemed to justify her boast. Antony was starting to feel smug. Then Cleopatra gestured for a single goblet of strong vinegar to be placed before her. She reached up, removed one of her earrings, one of a pair of the largest pearls in the known world gems that had been inherited through generations of Egyptian royalty, and dropped it into the vinegar. She watched it dissolve. Then she drank it. Pliny estimated the pearl was worth 10 million sesterces. In modern terms, historians who have attempted the conversion suggest something in the range of several $1,000,000, though the comparison is imperfect because the pearl's symbolic value was to the ancient world incalculable. The Roman general Lucius Munatius Plancus, who was serving as referee of the bet, immediately declared Cleopatra the winner. Was the story literally true? Pearls do dissolve in acid, but slowly, and vinegar is a weak acid. Modern scientists have replicated versions of the experiment with mixed results. Some historians believe the account was exaggerated or even invented as political propaganda against Cleopatra, painting her as recklessly wasteful. Others take Pliny at his word. But here is what I think matters: whether or not Cleopatra actually dissolved a pearl and drank it. The story was believed repeated and survived for 2,000 years because it felt true to what people understood about extreme wealth. It felt like something a person with infinite resources and the need to prove a point would actually do. And that, I think, is the real insight buried inside all of these Roman stories. Wealth beyond a certain point stops being about comfort or security, or even pleasure. It becomes performance. It becomes a language. And like any language, it inflates over time. Yesterday's extraordinary gesture becomes today's baseline. And so the display must grow larger, stranger, more impossible to ignore. Caligula built a bridge across the sea not because he needed to cross it. He built it because no one else could. Crassus named his fish because it was the only relationship in his life that could not betray him. Lucullus carved through a mountain because he had already bought everything else. And Cleopatra, whether or not the pearl story is true, understood that the most powerful statement she could make to a Roman general was not to show him her armies or her treasury, but to waste something priceless in front of him calmly without blinking. There is something almost uncomfortably modern about all of this. The architecture of excess looks different in every era, but the psychology underneath it stays remarkably consistent. When nothing has a price anymore, when no desire goes unfulfilled, the human spirit does not simply sit back and relax. It searches restlessly for something new to feel. And as we're about to discover in the next part of our journey, this restlessness led wealthy people to some truly extraordinary places, including, believe it or not, paying actual human beings to live in their gardens and pretend to be hermits. Yes, that is a real thing that happened, and it is somehow even stranger than it sounds. Stay with me. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever looked out at your backyard, maybe on a quiet Sunday morning, coffee in hand, and thought to yourself, you know what this place is missing? A person. Just a person. Living out there. Permanently. In a little stone hut. Not speaking, not bathing. Just sitting there being contemplative while you occasionally walk past and feel philosophical about things. No, just me. Well, apparently if you were a wealthy British landowner in the 18th century, that thought would have seemed not only reasonable but genuinely fashionable. Welcome to the world of the ornamental hermit. This is one of those chapters of history that sounds so absurd you almost wonder if someone made it up as a joke. But it is real, documented, and in its own strange way, it tells us something deeply revealing about what happens when human beings have accumulated so much wealth that they have exhausted every conventional form of entertainment. Here is the full picture. During the Georgian era in England, roughly spanning the 1700s and into the early 1800s, landscape gardening became the ultimate status symbol among the British aristocracy. If you had money, you did not just have a garden. You had a landscape. Rolling hills, artificial lakes, carefully positioned trees, meant to look wild and untamed while actually being arranged by professional designers charging extraordinary fees. The whole point was to create the feeling of walking through a painting. And paintings, of course, need figures in them. One popular style of painting at the time, deeply influenced by the Italian masters, often featured solitary figures in ruined landscapes. A robed philosopher seated among mossy stones. An old hermit in a cave, eyes cast downward deep in thought. These images carried enormous romantic weight. They suggested wisdom, melancholy, the passage of time, the smallness of human ambition against the grandeur of nature. So naturally wealthy English landowners thought, why paint it when you can just hire it, The practice was simple in concept and deeply strange in execution. A landowner would build what they called an ornamental hermitage on their estate, sometimes an elaborate stone grotto, sometimes a simple thatched hut, sometimes a full Gothic cave decorated with mirrors, bones and carved wooden furniture. Then they would advertise for a hermit. The contract varied from estate to estate, but most followed a similar pattern. The hired hermit was expected to live in the hermitage for a period of 7 years. During that time they could not cut their hair, their nails, or their beard. They could not leave the estate grounds. They were not permitted to speak to anyone. In many cases they were required to wear a monk's robe, carry an hourglass to symbolize the passage of time, and keep a human skull nearby as a memento mori, a reminder of death. In exchange, they would receive room board and a lump sum of money at the end of 7 years, typically around £700, which at the time represented several years of wages for a working-class person. I find myself genuinely torn about how to feel about this arrangement every time I think about it. On one hand, it sounds like a reasonable deal for someone willing to endure the conditions. On the other hand, imagine explaining it to someone who's never heard of it. Yes, I live in a stone cave in a rich man's garden. I'm not allowed to talk. I have a skull. It is my job. The most famous ornamental hermit in English history lived on the estate of Charles Hamilton at Painshill Park in Surrey, and his story is equal parts fascinating and quietly heartbreaking. Hamilton had spent years and a truly enormous fortune transforming his estate into one of the most celebrated landscape gardens in England. Visitors came from across Europe to walk its grounds. There was an artificial lake, a ruined abbey, a Turkish tent, a Gothic tower, a Chinese bridge, and eventually, inevitably, an elaborate hermitage built into a hillside decorated with twisted roots, pine cones, and sheets of bark. Hamilton advertised for a hermit, found a man willing to take the position, and the arrangement began. The hermit was installed in his hut with his robe, his skull, his hourglass, and his Bible. He was given strict instructions: no speaking, no leaving. 7 years and the money was his. He lasted 3 weeks. Guests discovered him one evening at a local tavern, drinking and chatting cheerfully with the locals. Hamilton dismissed him immediately, and the £700 payment was forfeited. Other estates had similar experiences. Some hermits lasted months. A handful, according to historical records compiled by Gordon Campbell in his book on the subject, reportedly completed the full 7 years. What those men experienced during that time, what it did to their minds, is something history has largely left unexamined. They did not write memoirs, they left no letters. They simply served their time and disappeared back into ordinary life, or perhaps not so ordinary after all. 7 years of enforced silence in a garden cave tends to leave marks. Now here is the question worth sitting with, and I think it is a genuinely interesting one. Why? Why did this practice exist at all? What were these wealthy landowners actually looking for? Part of the answer is purely aesthetic. The hermit was a living garden ornament, no different in principle from a marble statue or a carved stone bench. He completed the visual narrative the landscape was meant to tell. But I think there is something deeper going on, and it connects back to what we talked about in the first part of our journey tonight. The 18th century was a period of enormous wealth creation in Britain, driven by trade, by empire, by industrialization, beginning to reshape the economy. And with that wealth came a very particular kind of existential restlessness. The men who hired hermits were almost without exception men who had everything. Beautiful homes, social status, fine food, fine wine, fine art on every wall, and yet something was missing. What they seemed to have been purchasing, when you look at it carefully, was not the hermit himself, but the idea the hermit represented. The idea of a person who had renounced all of it, who sat in stillness rather than striving, who looked at an hourglass and a skull and did not flinch. In a world of acquisition and display, the hermit was the ultimate philosophical counterpoint. He was proof that withdrawal was possible, that depth existed, that meaning could be found outside the drawing room and the dinner party. The tragedy, of course, is that they were paying someone to perform that withdrawal. They were purchasing the appearance of wisdom, the way you would purchase a painting. They wanted the feeling of contemplation without having to actually sit still themselves. And there is something in that which I find achingly human. Not monstrous, not cruel, just human. The wealthy Georgian landowner standing at his window watching his hired hermit in the garden below was looking for something money genuinely cannot buy. He just did not quite know how to go about finding it any other way. The practice of ornamental hermits gradually faded by the early 19th century, as landscape tastes shifted, and the Gothic romanticism that had made hermitages fashionable began to feel old-fashioned. Some hermitages were converted into garden storage. Others were left to crumble into the landscape they'd been built to decorate. A few survive today as tourist curiosities. Painshill Park still stands in Surrey, and the hermitage has been restored. You can visit it. You can stand in the doorway of the little stone hut and imagine what it felt like to live there. The quiet, the birds, the slow passage of seasons, the skull grinning at you from its shelf. I visited a photograph of it once, and my honest first thought was it actually looks kind of peaceful, which may have been exactly the point all along. What the hermit craze tells us, and this is something I keep returning to, is that extreme wealth does not eliminate the basic human longing for meaning. If anything, it intensifies it. When survival is no longer a concern, when comfort is guaranteed, when novelty has been exhausted, the questions that ordinary life drowns out suddenly become very loud. Who am I? What is this all for? Is there something more? The Roman aristocrats we met earlier tried to answer those questions with fish ponds and mountain canals and bridges across the sea. The Georgian landowners tried to answer them by installing philosophical surrogates in their gardens. Both groups were reaching towards something they could feel, but not quite name. And here is what makes the next chapter of our story so extraordinary. Because across the Alps and a few centuries earlier, one of the most powerful families in all of European history tried to answer those very same questions in a completely different way. They did not hire hermits. They did not build bridges. They collected the dead. What the Medici family kept in their private rooms, and why their obsession with mummy skulls and strange objects ultimately helped give birth to modern science, that is where we're going next. There is a room in Florence that most tourists walk right past. It sits inside the Palazzo Vecchio, tucked behind a doorway that looks like just another wall panel. And when you step inside, if you're lucky enough to find it, you enter a space barely larger than a walk-in closet covered floor to ceiling in painted wooden panels that open like cabinet doors. Behind each one a compartment. And inside those compartments 200 years ago sat some of the strangest objects ever assembled by a single human mind. A unicorn horn, dried crocodile eggs, a piece of a giant's bone, bezoar stones pulled from the stomachs of Persian goats set in gold like precious gems, an Egyptian mummy's hand wrapped in linen resting on a silk cushion, powdered pearls in a glass vial, the tooth of a narwhal, the skull of a man who had reportedly lived past 140 years. This was the studiolo of Francesco I de' Medici, built in the 1570s, and it was in the eyes of its creator the most important room in all of Florence. To understand why a man who controlled one of the most powerful banking dynasties in Europe spent years obsessively filling a secret room with bones and bezoars, You have to understand what the Medici family was really building during the Renaissance, and it was not just banks. The Medici were collectors in the deepest sense of the word. Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch who established the family's dominance in Florence in the early 15th century, began the tradition not out of vanity, but out of genuine intellectual hunger. He funded the translation of Plato from Greek into Latin, a project that had not been completed in nearly 1,000 years. He built the first public library in Europe. He invited scholars and philosophers to his villa for conversations that would help lay the groundwork for the Renaissance itself. But by the time his descendant Francesco I came to power in the 1560s, something had shifted. The intellectual energy had curdled in a way into something stranger and more private. Francesco was not particularly interested in governing Florence. He left most of that to his advisors, while he disappeared for hours into his studiolo, surrounded by objects he believed held extraordinary powers. And here is the part that genuinely fascinates me, because Francesco was not simply a superstitious fool. He was a man of his era doing something that in the context of his time was actually considered quite serious and scientific. The collection he assembled was called a Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Wonders, and this was a genre of collection that existed all across Europe among the wealthy and educated elite of the 16th and 17th centuries. The logic behind the Wunderkammer went something like this. The world in the Renaissance understanding was filled with objects that embodied hidden forces. A bezoar stone formed in the stomach of a ruminant animal, usually a goat or a deer, was universally believed to be a powerful antidote to poison. And in an era when powerful men were frequently poisoned, this was not an abstract concern. Cosimo I, Francesco's own father, reportedly kept bezoar stones dissolved in his wine as a daily precaution. The belief was so widespread that bezoar stones were mounted in elaborate gold settings and given as royal gifts across Europe. Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France, brought bezoar stone traditions with her from Florence. Modern pharmacology has since tested bezoar stones, and found that while they are pharmacologically inert against most poisons, they do have a very weak neutralizing effect on arsenic in water. Whether that was enough to actually protect anyone is debatable, but the belief persisted for centuries, and among the wealthy the possession of a good bezoar was genuinely considered life insurance. Similarly, a unicorn horn, which was almost always the spiral tusk of a narwhal, brought down from the Arctic by traders who were either misrepresenting its origin or genuinely did not know, was considered in the same period to be worth several times its weight in gold. The royal pharmacy of Queen Elizabeth I of England contained a unicorn horn valued at £10,000 at a time when an average labourer earned less than £10 per year. Elizabeth reportedly used it to test her food for poison by dragging the horn across her plate before eating. So when Francesco de' Medici filled his studiolo with these objects, he was not being eccentric in the way we might imagine today. He was assembling what he understood to be a collection of genuine natural powers, the most scientifically significant objects in the world brought together in one place. But there is another layer to the Medici collection that goes beyond practical medicine or Renaissance superstition. And this is where the story gets truly interesting. The Medici did not only collect objects they believed were powerful, they collected things they could not explain. A jawbone too large to belong to any known animal, stones that seemed to grow inside other stones, a piece of amber with a fly frozen inside it, apparently mid-flight, preserved for what even Renaissance scholars understood was an impossibly long time, coral that grew in patterns resembling trees, a piece of rock that when struck gave off sparks. To Francesco and his contemporaries, these objects were proof that the natural world was far stranger and more layered than any current theory could account for. and in collecting them, in placing them together, comparing them, arguing about what they meant. The Medici were doing something that in retrospect looks remarkably like the beginning of empirical science. Here is a thought I find genuinely striking. The direct intellectual descendants of the Wunderkammer tradition are the natural history museums of the 19th and 20th centuries. The impulse to gather, organize, and make sense of the physical world, to say, look at all of this. Look at what exists now. Let us figure out why runs in a fairly straight line from Francesco's secret room in the Palazzo Vecchio to the Smithsonian Institution. The Medici were not doing science the way we would recognize it today. But they were doing something that science requires above all else. They were paying attention. They were refusing to dismiss what they did not understand. They were insisting with their wealth and their obsessive collecting that the strange thing in the corner deserved as much consideration as the beautiful thing on the wall. Now, of course, some of what they believed was simply wrong. The mummy's hand had no magical properties. The giant's bone was almost certainly a whale vertebra, or a large mammal femur misidentified by someone with no comparative anatomy. The powdered pearls dissolved in wine did not extend life, though they made for an impressively expensive beverage. And this is something I always find worth pausing on when we look at historical figures through modern eyes. It is very easy to read about Francesco de' Medici sitting in his little secret room with his unicorn horn and his bezoar stones and his Egyptian relics, and to feel superior, to smile and think, oh, how naive they were. But every era has its version of the Wunderkammer. Every era has its collection of objects and beliefs that the people holding them are absolutely convinced represent real power and real knowledge, and that future generations will look back on with the same gentle, slightly condescending fondness. The willingness to wonder, to collect, to insist on the importance of the unexplained, that is not naive. That is in fact the engine of every intellectual revolution in human history. Ask yourself, how many things do we accept as true today because someone with enough resources decided they were worth investigating, even when they could not yet explain them? Francesco de' Medici died in 1587 under circumstances that were fittingly mysterious. He and his wife Bianca both died within hours of each other, and for centuries historians debated whether they had been poisoned. Modern forensic analysis conducted on their remains in 2006 found traces of arsenic in their bones, though whether this was the actual cause of death or simply a product of the mineral-rich environment of their era remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. His studiolo was sealed after his death, and then forgotten for nearly 300 years, rediscovered in the 19th century, with most of its contents still intact. The room exists today preserved very close to the way he left it behind its hidden panel in the Palazzo Vecchio. If you ever find yourself in Florence, I would encourage you to find it. Stand in that small painted room and think about the man who built it, the man who believed sincerely and completely that the world held powers he had not yet understood, and who spent his considerable fortune trying to gather them close to him. There is something almost tender about that impulse when you hold it in the right light. The Medici, for all their wealth and power and political manoeuvring, were in their private lives reaching toward the same thing we all reach, toward a sense that the world is bigger and stranger than we fully grasp, and that somewhere in that strangeness there is something worth understanding. The Georgian hermit hires reach toward that feeling through the figure of the philosophical recluse. The Roman aristocrats reach toward it through grand gestures against nature. The Medici reach toward it through objects they pressed to their skin and placed beneath their pillows and kept locked in a room only they could enter. What none of them could have predicted, and what makes the next chapter of our journey Perhaps the most genuinely unsettling thing we have discussed so far is how far the wealthy of the 19th century would take that same impulse toward the ancient world, because when vast wealth, obsessive curiosity, and the mummies of Egypt collided in the drawing rooms of Victorian England, what happened next was something that, even by the standards of everything we've explored tonight, occupies a category entirely its own. The Victorians did not just collect the ancient dead, they invited their friends over, poured the brandy and unwrapped them at the dinner table. Let me paint you a picture. It is a winter evening in London, sometime around 1830. Outside, the fog has settled thick and low over the city the way it does in those old engravings, where you can barely see the lampposts. Inside a grand townhouse near Piccadilly, the drawing room is warm and bright with candlelight. The guests have finished their dinner, roasted pheasant perhaps, or a saddle of lamb with syllabub for dessert. The port is being poured. The ladies and gentlemen are settling into their chairs with the particular satisfied comfort of people who have eaten very well and have nothing pressing to attend to. And then the host dims the room just slightly. The servants bring in a long object wrapped in ancient linen, brown and brittle with age. It is placed on the central table. The guests lean forward. The evening's entertainment is about to begin. What they are about to watch, what they have specifically come to see, is the unwrapping of a genuine Egyptian mummy. A person who lived and breathed 3,000 years ago, now laid out on a mahogany dining table in a London townhouse, while a surgeon with excellent social connections narrates the proceedings in careful, precise English. And every single person in that room thinks this is a completely normal, thoroughly civilized way to spend an evening. The Victorian obsession with ancient Egypt is one of the most fascinating cultural phenomena in modern history, and it is also one of the most uncomfortable to reckon with honestly. It began, as many strange chapters of history do, with a single overwhelming event. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt with an army of 38,000 soldiers and, crucially, 151 scholars, artists, scientists and engineers whom he called his Commission of Arts and Sciences. These men spent 3 years documenting every monument, inscription, plant, animal and artifact they could find. The result, published between 1809 and 1829 in a staggering 23-volume work called The Description de l'Égypte, was nothing less than the introduction of ancient Egypt to the modern Western world. Europe went absolutely wild. Within a decade, Egyptian motifs were appearing on furniture, jewellery, architecture and wallpaper across Britain and France. Cleopatra-style headdresses became fashionable. Obelisks were transplanted to Paris and London. And most significantly for our story, Egyptian artifacts, including mummies, began appearing on the private market in quantities that would be considered horrifying by any modern standard of cultural preservation. Wealthy Europeans bought mummies the way they bought paintings. They displayed them in their country houses. They corresponded with dealers in Cairo and Alexandria about the quality of available specimens. And beginning in the early 19th century, some of them began hosting what they called mummy unwrapping evenings, private events, where a mummy would be publicly unrolled before an invited audience. The man most associated with this practice, and the one whose name appears most consistently in historical records, was a surgeon and antiquarian named Thomas Joseph Pettigrew. And here is where the story shifts from merely strange to genuinely remarkable, because Pettigrew was not simply a showman. He was, by the standards of his era, a serious scientist. Pettigrew had trained as a surgeon and developed a genuine fascination with ancient Egyptian medicine and embalming techniques. He taught himself to read hieroglyphs, studied the anatomy of mummified remains, and eventually published a book in 1834 called A History of Egyptian Mummies, one of the first serious academic treatments of the subject in the English language. But Pettigrew also understood, with the instinct of a man who genuinely loved an audience, that the best way to fund and publicize his research was to make it spectacular, and so he began hosting his unwrapping events first in private homes, then in increasingly public venues. At his most theatrical, Pettigrew would arrange the evening like a performance. He would speak for an hour about the history of the mummy, who they might have been, what period they came from, how they were likely embalmed. He would explain the layers of wrapping, the significance of the amulets placed between the linen bands, the resin that had been poured over the body to preserve it. And then slowly and methodically he would begin to unwrap. Guests were invited to examine what was revealed: the cartonnage masks painted with idealized faces, the preserved linen packing material, the hardened body beneath. On occasion, Pettigrew would identify medical conditions visible in the remains: arthritis in the joints, dental decay, evidence of healed fractures. He became eventually so associated with mummies that when a wealthy patron named Alexander Douglas, the Duke of Hamilton, died in 1852, he had specifically requested in his will that Pettigrew mummify and inter him in an Egyptian-style sarcophagus that Hamilton had purchased years earlier during his Egyptian travels. Pettigrew obliged. The Duke of Hamilton was mummified in Victorian England and placed in an ancient Egyptian coffin, where he remains to this day in the family mausoleum. I genuinely do not know whether that is the strangest thing I have ever encountered in my research into this period, but it is certainly in the running. Now, I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters when we talk about this particular chapter of history. The Victorian mummy unwrapping parties occupy a deeply uncomfortable space in the modern imagination. On one hand, men like Pettigrew were genuinely advancing the understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization at a time when almost nothing was known about it. The anatomical observations he made during his unwrappings contributed meaningfully to the emerging field of Egyptology. Several of his observations about embalming techniques were not confirmed by later research for decades. On the other hand, these were human beings, people who had been given elaborate sacred burials by communities that believed deeply in the importance of preserving the body for the afterlife. The removal of mummies from Egypt, their sale on the open market, and their unwrapping for the entertainment of European drawing room guests represents a profound violation of the dead that the Victorians were able to perform with easy conscience, because they did not extend full human consideration to the people those remains had once been. That is a tension worth sitting with, I think. The history of knowledge is full of it. The science was real. The disrespect was also real. Both things are true simultaneously, and erasing either one does a disservice to a genuinely complex story. What's perhaps most revealing about the mummy unwrapping parties, though the thing that connects them most directly to the broader theme of our journey tonight, is the specific form of entertainment they provided. Consider what the wealthy Victorian guests at a Pettigrew unwrapping were actually getting. They were not simply satisfying idle curiosity. They were purchasing proximity to something ancient, mysterious, and utterly outside the boundaries of their ordinary experience. A mummy lying on the dining table represented a direct physical connection to a civilization 3,000 years gone, to a world where the gods had animal heads, where the dead were preserved for eternity, where the Nile rose and fell in rhythms that had nothing to do with the London fog outside the window. It was in a sense the ultimate souvenir, not something you could look at from a distance in a museum, though museums were also filling with Egyptian artifacts at an extraordinary rate during this same period, but something you could touch, examine and discuss in your own home, surrounded by people you had chosen to invite. The Medici had done something similar with their Wunderkammer, filling private rooms with objects that connected them to realms of knowledge and power beyond the ordinary. The Georgian hermit hirers had done it with a living person playing the role of timeless wisdom. Now the Victorians were doing it with the actual preserved bodies of the ancient world laid out on their own furniture in their own lamplight. The common thread across all 3 centuries and all 3 wildly different expressions of wealth is this hunger for contact with something that transcends the present moment, something that says the world is larger than what I can see from here, and I am rich enough to reach out and touch it. Pettigrew died in 1865, having unwrapped dozens of mummies over the course of his career, and having written extensively about what he found. His work is still cited in Egyptological literature today, which tells you something about the genuine intellectual value buried inside even the most theatrical chapter of this story. The mummy unwrapping parties faded as the 19th century progressed, and professional archaeology began to establish stricter norms around the handling of ancient remains. By the time Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and found it essentially intact, the world had shifted enough that the discovery was treated as a moment of profound cultural reverence rather than an invitation to a dinner party. Though I will confess, and perhaps this is the historian in me coming out, I sometimes wonder what Pettigrew would have made of that discovery. Whether he would have felt vindicated or humbled or simply desperate to be in the room. Probably all 3 if I had to guess. The scale of wealth required to host a mummy unwrapping evening was substantial. A well-preserved specimen could cost what an ordinary working family might earn in several years, but it was still within reach of the upper middle-class professional class that was expanding rapidly in Victorian England. That accessibility is part of what made the practice so widespread, which raises a question worth considering as we move forward through this story. What happens when wealth becomes so extreme that even the ancient dead are not enough? When the entire visible world, past and present, has been collected, examined, unwrapped, and discussed over port? The answer, as we're about to discover, involves one man, 15 miles of tunnels dug beneath the English countryside, a ballroom large enough for 2,000 people that was never once used, and a level of voluntary isolation that would make even the most committed ornamental hermit feel comparatively sociable. Sometimes it turns out the strangest habit wealth can produce is the simple desire to disappear entirely from the world that wealth built. Somewhere beneath the rolling green fields of Nottinghamshire, England, there is a tunnel. Not a small tunnel, not the kind of modest passageway you might find connecting a wine cellar to a kitchen. This tunnel is wide enough for 2 carriages to pass each other side by side. It is lit, or it was in the 1860s, by gas lamps placed at regular intervals along its walls. It stretches for over a mile through the earth from the main house of Welbeck Abbey to the estate's riding school, and it is just one of 15 miles of underground tunnels that one man commissioned, funded and obsessively expanded across a period of roughly 30 years. That man was William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck, the 5th Duke of Portland, and his story is, in my view, one of the most psychologically arresting accounts of wealth and isolation in the entire historical record, because the Duke of Portland did not build his tunnels for any practical reason that historians have ever been able to fully explain. He built them as far as anyone can determine, so that he would never have to be seen. To understand how a man ends up digging 15 miles of tunnels under his own estate, you have to start with the estate itself, and with who the Duke was before the tunnels began. Welbeck Abbey in Nottinghamshire was one of the grandest private estates in England. Originally a medieval monastery, it had been transformed over centuries into an enormous country house, surrounded by thousands of acres of parkland. By the time the 5th Duke inherited it in 1854, it contained dozens of rooms, formal gardens, stables, a lake, and all the physical apparatus of Victorian aristocratic life at its most opulent. The Duke was by all accounts an intelligent man. He had served briefly in the military, and had shown no particular signs of eccentricity in his younger years. He was wealthy beyond most people's ability to comprehend the Cavendish-Bentinck family's holdings, extended across vast tracts of English and Scottish land, and the annual income from those estates was staggering. He was also, as he aged, profoundly, almost pathologically shy. Historical accounts of the Duke describe a man who could not tolerate being looked at by other people. He communicated with his staff through written notes slipped under doors. He would not receive visitors under any circumstances. When he was ill and required a doctor, the doctor was permitted to examine him only through a double door, seeing nothing of his patient. When the Duke travelled by carriage, which he did though rarely the carriage windows were covered so that no one could observe him inside. He was not by any medical definition we have available agoraphobic in the traditional sense because he did move around his own estate freely. He simply could not bear to be seen by other human beings while he did so. And so he went underground. The tunnelling began in earnest in the 1860s and continued for nearly 2 decades. At its peak, the Duke employed somewhere between 1,500 and 4,000 workers on his underground construction projects. Accounts vary, but all agree the workforce was enormous. These men were paid generously and reportedly given strict instructions not to acknowledge the Duke if they happened to encounter him during one of his subterranean walks. If a worker accidentally looked at the Duke directly, historical accounts suggest they risked immediate dismissal. What was being built was essentially a parallel world beneath the existing one. The main tunnel, the carriage-width corridor running to the riding school, was just the beginning. There was a tunnel connecting to the local train station reportedly constructed so that the Duke could travel to London without ever being observed boarding or disembarking in public. There was a tunnel leading to the kitchen gardens. There was an underground suite of rooms, including a library and what appeared to be private apartments. Above ground, meanwhile, the Duke was also building, but building spaces he never intended to use. The ballroom at Welbeck Abbey, constructed during this same period, is one of the largest private ballrooms ever built in England. It measured over 170 feet in length and could accommodate an audience of 2,000 people. It was connected to the house by naturally a tunnel, and in the entire duration of the 5th Duke's ownership of the estate from 1854 until his death in 1879, no ball was ever held there. No concert, no dinner party, no gathering of any kind. He built a ballroom for 2,000 people and then sat alone in the dark beneath his own garden. I find that image genuinely haunting, and I've thought about it many times since I first encountered this story. There is a temptation when reading about the 5th Duke of Portland to diagnose him at a comfortable distance, to reach for a clinical label that explains everything neatly and lets us move on, and perhaps that instinct is not entirely wrong. Modern psychologists who have examined the historical accounts have speculated about severe social anxiety, about what we might today call avoidant personality disorder, about the complex interactions between inherited wealth, the particular pressures of Victorian masculinity and public life, and whatever combination of experience and temperament shaped this specific man. But I think there is something more interesting going on than a simple diagnosis allows for. Consider the act of building specifically. The Duke was not merely hiding, he was constructing. He employed thousands of people. He managed enormous projects. He oversaw the engineering of miles of underground infrastructure that by any technical standard was genuinely impressive. The tunnels were properly lined, ventilated, and maintained. The ballroom above was structurally magnificent. This was not a man paralyzed by his inner world. It was a man who channeled extraordinary energy and resources into creating an environment that precisely matched his psychological needs, a world in which he could move freely, work freely, live freely, but never be observed. In a strange way, the Duke of Portland was doing something that all the wealthy eccentrics in our story have been doing, just in a more literal and more architectural form. He was using his wealth to reshape reality until it fit him, until the external world matched the internal one. The Roman aristocrats reshaped the world through spectacle. The Georgian landowners reshaped it through the philosophical theatre of the ornamental garden. The Medici reshaped it through the collection of objects that made the unknown feel knowable. The Victorians reshaped it through proximity to the ancient dead. The Duke of Portland reshaped it by going underground. He died in 1879, leaving no wife, no children, and no explanation. His will was straightforward. The estate passed to other members of the family who found themselves inheriting not only one of the grandest houses in England, but also 15 miles of tunnels they had absolutely no use for. The tunnels are still there today. Welbeck Abbey was eventually converted into an arts college and a private school, and the underground passages remain a documented curiosity that visitors occasionally tour. The great ballroom, the one built for 2,000 guests who never came, was subdivided into smaller rooms sometime in the 20th century, which feels like the right ending for a space that was always in some sense too large for the reality around it. What the 5th Duke of Portland leaves behind beyond the tunnels themselves is a question that I think sits quietly at the centre of a great deal of wealth psychology. He had more resources than almost any person alive in Victorian England. He could have gone anywhere, done anything, seen anything. The world was in the most literal sense available to him, and he chose to go down. Not out of despair, as far as historians can determine. He seems to have been content in his way within the world he built, but out of a profound mismatch between who he was inside and what the world outside required him to be. There is something in that, I think, that is not so far from a feeling many of us recognise even without the tunnels and the duchy and the unoccupied ballroom. The wish that the world would simply stop looking at you for a moment. The desire to move through life without being observed, without having to perform, without the constant friction of other people's expectations pressing against the edges of your existence. Most of us manage that feeling with a long walk or an afternoon alone. The 5th Duke of Portland managed it with a shovel and 4,000 workers. The accounts of his daily life suggest a man who was in private rather orderly and even cheerful. He kept chickens and was reportedly fond of them. He read extensively. He ate well. By some accounts, he sent food from his kitchens to workers on the estate during cold weather. Whatever demons drove him underground, they did not appear to make him cruel or bitter. He was simply a man who had decided with great thoroughness and considerable financial commitment that the above-ground world was not for him. And on those terms, the terms he himself had set, he seems to have lived rather well. Of course, the desire to disappear, to retreat, to build walls between oneself and the rest of humanity is only one expression of what extreme wealth can do to a person. It sits at one end of a very long spectrum. At the other end sits something we have not yet explored, a hunger not for silence and invisibility, but for the precise opposite, for power over nature itself, for the conquest of time, for the ability to cheat death through sheer financial force. Because while the Duke of Portland was burrowing peacefully under his Nottinghamshire fields halfway across the world, the most powerful emperors in Chinese history were doing something that made his tunnels look almost modest by comparison. They were sending entire fleets of ships across unknown oceans in search of a drink that would make them live forever, and the story of what those emperors actually consumed in that pursuit, and what it did to them, is genuinely one of the most extraordinary cautionary tales in the entire history of human ambition. Of all the strange habits that wealth has ever produced in human history, the one we're about to explore is perhaps the most universal and the most dangerous. Because while some of history's richest people were building tunnels under their estates or hiring hermits to sit in their gardens, the emperors of China were pursuing something that has tempted powerful people in every culture and every century since the beginning of recorded time. They wanted to live forever. not as a metaphor, not as a spiritual concept. They wanted their physical bodies to continue breathing, thinking, and ruling indefinitely without decay, without illness, without the indignity of having to hand power to someone else. They believed with complete sincerity that this was achievable, that somewhere in the vast natural world there existed a substance, a formula, a place, or a practice that would unlock biological immortality for the man wealthy and worthy enough to find it. And they spent fortunes trying. The story begins, as so many chapters of Chinese imperial history do, with the first emperor himself. Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BC, after decades of brutal warfare, creating the first centralized empire in Chinese history. He standardized the currency, the weights and measures, the writing system, and the road network. He began construction of what would eventually become the Great Wall. He commissioned the extraordinary terracotta army, over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers, horses and chariots buried with him, to protect him in the afterlife, at a cost in human labor that staggers the imagination even today. He was by any measure one of the most consequential rulers in world history. He was also, by the accounts of his own court historians, absolutely terrified of dying. From roughly his late 30s onward, Qin Shi Huang became increasingly preoccupied with what Chinese scholars of the era called Xian immortality, or more precisely the state of becoming an immortal being who had transcended the ordinary limits of human existence. He received delegations of Taoist alchemists and mystics who promised they could guide him toward this state. He funded expeditions to distant islands in the Eastern Sea Islands that, according to tradition, were the home of immortal beings who possessed the elixir of life. The most famous of these expeditions was led by a man named Xu Fu, who reportedly sailed east from the Chinese coast in approximately 219 BC, with a fleet of ships carrying hundreds of young men and women, along with seeds, tools, and supplies for a long voyage. The stated mission was to find the mythical islands of Penglefangjiang and Yingzhou, where the immortals lived, and to return with their secret. Xu Fu never came back. He sent a message to the emperor explaining that a great sea serpent was blocking his passage and requesting more ships and more archers. The emperor, apparently willing to entertain this explanation, sent reinforcements. Xu Fu sailed again, and was never seen again. Where he actually went has been a subject of speculation for 2,000 years. Some historians believe he reached Japan. There are coastal communities in Japan today that claim descent from Xu Fu's expedition, and there is a tomb dedicated to him in Wakayama Prefecture. Others believe the expedition was simply lost at sea. A few scholars have suggested a little unkindly that Xu Fu decided he had a better chance of living a long life somewhere far away from an emperor who executed people for disappointing him. I find that last theory entirely plausible, if I am being honest. Qin Shi Huang never found his elixir. He died in 210 BC at the age of approximately 49, relatively young, even by ancient standards, while on a tour of his empire. The cause of death, according to historians who have analysed the available records, was very likely mercury poisoning. This requires a moment of explanation because it is one of the great dark ironies of history. The Taoist alchemists who advised Qin Shi Huang had developed elaborate theories about substances that could extend life or confer immortality. Mercury liquid mercury, the silver metal that moves like water, held a particularly exalted place in their pharmacopoeia. It was strange. It was beautiful. It behaved unlike any other substance they knew. It seemed in its fluid unpredictability to possess a kind of living quality. And so they prescribed it. The emperor consumed pills and elixirs containing mercury and other heavy metals, lead, arsenic regularly and in substantial quantities. He believed he was protecting himself from death. He was in fact accelerating it. The mercury deposits found in the soil around his tomb complex at Mount Li, when analysed by modern researchers, are extraordinary in their concentration. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after the emperor's death, described the interior of the tomb as containing rivers and seas of liquid mercury, whether as a literal description or as symbolic language is still debated. Modern geophysical surveys of the sealed tomb site have detected unusually high concentrations of mercury in the ground above it, which suggests the account had at least some basis in fact. So the man who built an army of 8,000 clay soldiers to protect him in death may have been slowly undone by the very substances he believed would keep him from dying. History has a particular taste for this kind of irony. What makes this story even richer is that Qin Shi Huang was not the last Chinese emperor to travel this particular road. The pursuit of imperial immortality did not die with him. It became over the following centuries a recurring pattern, almost a ritual in which successive dynasties produced their own versions of the same tragic story. During the Han Dynasty, Emperor Wu, one of the longest reigning and most militarily ambitious emperors in Chinese history, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC, became similarly obsessed. He built towers specifically designed to collect celestial dew, which he then drank mixed with powdered jade, believing that jade possessed life-prolonging properties. He hosted delegations of alchemists from across the empire, funded their research generously, and waited for results that never came. Emperor Wu lived to approximately 70 years of age, which was genuinely exceptional for his era, so perhaps the jade dew was doing something, or perhaps he simply had robust genetics. He died still searching. The Tang dynasty produced perhaps the most concentrated sequence of imperial mercury poisonings in Chinese history. At least 6 Tang emperors, Taizong, Xuanzong, Muzong, Jingzong, Wuzong, and Xuanzong II, are believed by modern historians to have consumed elixirs containing heavy metals as part of their pursuit of extended life. Several of them died at relatively young ages of what their court physicians described as mysterious ailments consistent with heavy metal toxicity. Taizong, one of the most celebrated emperors in Chinese history, a man of genuine intellectual gifts who presided over what historians call a golden age of Tang culture, reportedly became erratic, irritable, and physically ill in his later years after consuming Indian elixirs brought to him by foreign merchants. He died at 51. There is a bitter poetry in the fact that the substances these men consumed in their desperate attempt to conquer mortality were in many cases the very mechanism of their deaths. The harder they reached for immortality, the faster time ran. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this chapter of history invites a kind of easy mockery that it does not entirely deserve. It is tempting to look at the Chinese emperors consuming mercury pills and feel superior, to think, well, obviously that was not gonna work, what were they thinking? But consider the context, honestly. These were men operating with the best scientific understanding available to them at the time. Taoist alchemy was not pseudoscience. In the same dismissive sense we might use that word today, it was a sophisticated tradition of inquiry into the natural world that produced genuine insights into chemistry, metallurgy and medicine, alongside its more problematic applications. The discovery of gunpowder, for instance, emerged from Taoist alchemical experimentation. The men advising the emperors were not charlatans in the simple sense of the word. They were mostly sincere practitioners of a tradition they genuinely believed in. And the emperors themselves were not fools. Many of them were exceptionally intelligent men who happened to be operating without the benefit of modern toxicology. What they were almost uniformly was desperate, and that desperation, the specific trembling desperation of a man who controls everything except the one thing he wants most, is something that does not require a particular historical era to understand. It is simply what happens when a human being with unlimited power confronts the one limit that no amount of power has ever been able to remove. Does that sound familiar at all? It should, because as we're going to discover a little later in our journey tonight, the desire to cheat death with money did not end with the Tang dynasty. It simply changed its vocabulary. The quest for immortality through chemistry, the belief that the right substance properly administered could extend or indefinitely suspend biological aging, runs through human history like a river that occasionally goes underground but never truly disappears. The Chinese emperors drank mercury. Medieval European alchemists spent centuries searching for the philosopher's stone, which they believed could transmute metals into gold and produce an elixir of life. 16th century explorers searched the Americas for a fountain of youth. 19th century physicians experimented with organ extracts and electrical stimulation. And in our own century, billionaires are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on longevity research, blood plasma transfusions from younger donors, genetic therapies, cryonics, and 100 other approaches that future historians may very well look back on with the same mixture of sympathy and amusement that we extend to Qin Shi Huang and his mercury pills. The technology changes, the hunger underneath it does not. But here is what genuinely strikes me about the Chinese emperors specifically, and what I think sets their story slightly apart from the other chapters we have explored tonight. The quest for immortality was not purely selfish in their minds. It was at least in part political. An emperor who lived forever would be an emperor who could never be replaced. An empire ruled by an undying sovereign would be in theory an empire of perfect stability. No succession crises, no regency periods, no dangerous interregnums where power was up for grabs. The immortal emperor was not just a personal fantasy. It was a vision of political order so complete and so stable that chaos itself would have no foothold. That the pursuit of this vision killed several of the men who held it most fervently is one of the more quietly devastating observations that history offers us. And speaking of political visions expressed through extravagant and slightly bewildering personal habits, we're about to move from the courts of imperial China to the drawing rooms of Gilded Age America, where the richest men and women in the history of the United States were competing with each other in ways that made even the Roman banquets of Lucullus look by comparison almost restrained. They were throwing dinner parties for their dogs, full multi-course dinner parties, with menus and place settings. I am not making this up. Stay with me. The year is 1904. The location is Newport, Rhode Island, the summer playground of American royalty, where the Atlantic breeze carries the faint scent of salt water and old money in equal measure. On Bellevue Avenue, the grand cottages, and I use that word loosely, because some of these cottages contained over 70 rooms, sit behind iron gates and manicured hedgerows, their windows blazing with electric light on a warm August evening. The Vanderbilts are hosting somewhere, the Astors are holding court somewhere else, and at a particularly well-appointed estate something is happening in the dining room that you genuinely need a moment to absorb before you can accept it as real. 100 dogs are sitting at a dinner table, not sitting around a bowl on the floor in the way you might give a dog a treat. Sitting at a long, formally set table with flower centerpieces with place cards bearing their names, with servants attending to their needs, while their owners dressed in their evening finest look on from the sides of the room with expressions of complete uncomplicated delight. The menu for the evening includes fricassee of bones served in paper cases, braised liver with vegetables, and a dessert course of rice pudding. The dogs are wearing their best ribbons. A small orchestra is playing. This was not a private eccentricity that someone stumbled upon by accident. It was a reported social event covered by the press, organized by a man who was one of the most celebrated hosts in American high society. His name was Harry Lear, and the dog dinner party is just the beginning of what he represents. To understand Harry Lear and what he tells us about the Gilded Age, you first need to understand the world he was operating in. because it was a world that had been deliberately constructed around the performance of excess and which required increasingly dramatic performances to sustain itself. The period Americans call the Gilded Age, roughly from the 1870s through the first years of the 20th century, was the era of the robber barons. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P., Morgan Cornelius Vanderbilt and his descendants William Waldorf Astor, these men accumulated fortunes of a scale that had never existed before in American history, and that still rank among the largest in history when adjusted for the size of the economy. Rockefeller at his peak controlled roughly 1.5% of the entire United States GDP. Carnegie's fortune at his retirement was equivalent to approximately $310 billion in modern terms. Morgan personally stabilized the United States banking system during a financial panic in 1907, essentially acting as the Federal Reserve a decade before the Federal Reserve existed. These were not merely wealthy people. They were forces of nature wearing frock coats. And in the social world that grew up around them, the primary occupation of their wives, their children, and their social satellites was the performance of status. Not the accumulation of status that had already been accomplished, often brutally, in the counting houses and the coal mines and the oil fields. The performance of it. The daily elaborate, exhausting ritual of demonstrating through clothes and houses and parties and horses and art and travel, and the guest lists of dinner parties that one occupied a position in society that was both magnificent and legitimate. It was in a very real sense a full-time job, and some people were better at it than others. Harry Lear was by any accounting extraordinarily good at it. Born in Baltimore in 1869 to a family of modest means, Lear possessed what can only be described as a genius for social performance. He was witty, charming, beautifully dressed, and had an instinctive understanding of what the very rich wanted, which was more than anything else to be entertained, to be surprised, to be given something to talk about the next morning at breakfast that they had not seen before. He attached himself to Mrs. Mamie Fish, one of the great society hostesses of Newport and New York, and together they became for approximately 2 decades the most talked-about entertainment duo in American high society. Their parties became famous for their deliberate absurdity, for the studied theatrical quality of their outrageousness. There was the dinner party at which all of the invited guests arrived to discover that the guest of honor was a monkey, a real monkey dressed in formal evening wear seated at the head of the table. The monkey was introduced to other guests, offered food, and treated throughout the evening with the full ceremonial courtesy extended to a distinguished human visitor. Accounts from guests suggest that the main emotion in the room was not outrage, but helpless, slightly bewildered laughter. There was the evening when Lear and Mrs. Fish invited their social circle to a formal dinner and then served nothing but plain food, simple boiled dishes, humble vegetables, bread without butter. The joke, if you could call it that, was on the guests' expectations. After seasons of extraordinary culinary extravagance, the most shocking thing Lear could serve was ordinary. And then there was the dog dinner, which remains the most famous and most frequently cited event of his career. Held at his Newport estate, it reportedly brought together 100 dogs belonging to Newport society families, each accompanied by a servant to assist with the proceedings. The invitations were printed and sent through the mail exactly as formal dinner invitations would be. The placecards bore the dogs' names in careful calligraphy. The estimated cost of the evening adjusted to modern values runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now here is the part of this story that I find genuinely worth thinking about, because it is easy to dismiss all of this as simple decadence and miss what was actually happening underneath the surface. The Newport society world of the Gilded Age was, for all its glittering surface, a place of extraordinary anxiety. The rules governing who was acceptable and who was not, who could attend Mrs. Asta's ball and who would be excluded were elaborate, constantly shifting and enforced with a ruthlessness that would not have looked out of place in a royal court. Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society for decades, famously declared that her ballroom could hold only 400 people comfortably, and from this emerged the concept of the 400, the social shorthand for the only people who truly mattered in American high society at that moment. 400 people in a country of 70 million. The pressure to belong to that world, to maintain one's position within it, to avoid the social death of exclusion, was immense for the families who had built their lives around it. And what Harry Lear understood with his performer's instinct was that absurdity was a release valve. When you organize a dinner party for 100 dogs, you're not simply wasting money. You're performing a very specific kind of power. You're saying the rules that everyone else takes so seriously, the menus, the place cards, the careful hierarchy of the seating arrangement are a game. A game I am choosing to play with dogs tonight instead of people. Because I can. It was the same logic that Caligula applied when he built his bridge across the sea. It was the same logic that Cleopatra applied when she dissolved her pearl. The gesture says, I am so far above the constraints that bind everyone else that I can use the symbols of those constraints as toys. The difference, and it is not an insignificant one, is that Lear was performing this for an audience that shared his world. The Roman emperors performed for history. The Gilded Age performed for each other and for the press, which covered these events with a mixture of outrage and fascinated detail that served everyone's interest perfectly. What strikes me most when I read about this period is the sheer self-awareness of it. The participants in Newport society were not naive. They knew on some level that the dog dinner was absurd. They knew that the gap between their lives and the lives of the workers who built their railroads and mined their coal was morally untenable. Mark Twain, who gave the air its name and understood it with the precision of a surgeon, wrote about this gap constantly and mercilessly. But knowing something is absurd does not make it stop. It sometimes makes it more elaborate. The final years of the Gilded Age extravagance came to an abrupt end with the income tax, the Progressive Era reforms, and eventually the trauma of the First World War, which reconfigured the social landscape of both America and Europe in ways that made Newport-style excess suddenly feel not just wasteful, but actively obscene. Harry Lear died in Paris in 1929, the same year the stock market crashed. He had outlived the world that made him possible by about a decade, and spent his final years in a kind of irrelevance that by all accounts bewildered him completely. His memoirs, published posthumously, reveal a man who genuinely loved the performance, who was not cynical about it but enchanted by it, who believed in the importance of beauty and spectacle and laughter as genuine goods in the world, even when the vehicle for those goods was a formally set dinner table full of dogs. I find it very difficult to entirely disagree with him. The Gilded Age extravagance was in the end a performance of wealth so total and so complete that it consumed itself. The 400 became the subject of satire before they became the subject of history. The cottages of Newport are museums. Now you can pay $25 to walk through the breakers and marvel at the scale of what one family considered a summer house. But the impulse underneath all of it, the need to make the invisible visible, to turn the abstract fact of extreme wealth into something that could be seen and felt and talked about, that impulse did not disappear with the Newport season. It simply migrated across an ocean and several centuries back in time to a garden in Istanbul, where candlelight was flickering on the shells of slow-moving turtles, each one carrying a small lamp on its back, walking through the tulip beds of a sultan who'd invented perhaps the most beautiful and certainly the most botanically expensive party in the history of the Ottoman Empire. What the Tulip Age of Istanbul looked like and why it ended in revolution is where we are going next. Close your eyes for just a moment and try to picture this. It is a warm spring night in Istanbul, sometime round 1720. The air above the Bosphorus is soft and still, and in the vast gardens of Topkapi Palace something is happening that has no real equivalent anywhere else in history. Something so delicate, so deliberately beautiful, and so spectacularly impractical that it almost defies description. Hundreds of tulips are in bloom, thousands of them actually arranged in precise geometric patterns, each variety selected for the perfection of its colour and the elegance of its petal shape. And moving slowly between those flower beds, carrying small oil lamps on their shells, are live tortoises, dozens of them, walking at their own unhurried pace through the tulip gardens in the dark, their tiny flames casting a moving, shimmering light across the flowers. Caged songbirds hang at intervals between the tulip beds, singing into the night air. Crystal bowls of water are placed among the blossoms to catch and scatter the lamplight. Musicians sit at the edges of the garden playing softly, and presiding over all of it, reclining on cushions of embroidered silk, is Sultan Ahmed III, a man who had decided with the full weight of an imperial treasury behind him that the tulip was the most important thing in the world. This is the Leyla Devri, the tulip period, and it is one of the strangest, most gorgeous and most politically explosive chapters in the entire history of Ottoman wealth. To understand how a flower became the centre of an empire's social universe, you have to go back slightly further to the moment tulips arrived in Europe, and to what happened next, because it is one of the most extraordinary economic stories in recorded history. Tulips are native to Central Asia and the mountain meadows of what is now Turkey and Iran. They were cultivated in Ottoman gardens for centuries before European eyes ever encountered them, and in Ottoman culture they already carried significant symbolic weight, associated with paradise, with spring, with the beauty of divine creation. The word tulip, in fact, comes from the Turkish word for turban, referring to the flower's shape. In the 1550s, the first tulip bulbs arrived in Western Europe, carried by diplomats and travellers from the Ottoman court. They reached the botanical gardens of Vienna, then the Netherlands, then England and France. And what happened next, particularly in the Dutch Republic, was something that modern economists still cite as the first recorded speculative financial bubble in Western history. Tulip mania. You may have heard of it. Between roughly 1634 and 1637, the price of tulip bulbs in the Dutch Republic rose to levels that even now are almost impossible to comprehend. Rare varieties, particularly a type called Semper Augustus, which displayed dramatic streaks of red on white petals caused by a virus that infected the plant, changed hands for prices that exceeded the cost of a fine house on an Amsterdam canal. At the peak of the market, a single Semper Augustus bulb reportedly sold for approximately 6,000 guilders. To give you a sense of what that means, a skilled Dutch craftsman of that era earned roughly 300 guilders per year, one tulip bulb, 20 years of wages. Futures contracts were written on bulbs that had not yet been dug from the ground. People sold their houses, their livestock, their tools to enter the tulip market. And then in February of 1637, the market collapsed almost overnight. A scheduled auction in Haarlem failed to attract any buyers. Panic spread. The price of bulbs that had been worth fortunes became within weeks worth nothing at all. Hundreds of Dutch families were ruined. The social shock lasted for years. And the cause of all this, remember, was a flower. A very beautiful flower, granted, but a flower. What I find genuinely fascinating about the tulip mania, especially when I set it alongside the Ottoman Leyla Devri that came about 80 years later, is what it reveals about the psychology of beautiful things in the hands of the very wealthy. The Dutch tulip speculators were not for the most part flower lovers. They were investors who recognized that other people loved flowers very much or at least loved the idea of owning something rare and beautiful that other people did not have, and who decided to profit from that love. The tulip became a vehicle for financial speculation precisely because it had first been established as a symbol of taste exclusivity and refinement. Sultan Ahmed III, by contrast, genuinely loved tulips. His passion was not financial but aesthetic, bordering, his court historians suggest, on obsessive. During the tulip period, which lasted from approximately 1718 to 1730, Ahmed transformed his court's social calendar around the spring tulip season. The imperial gardens were expanded and redesigned specifically to showcase new varieties. Tulip cultivation became a regulated industry. The imperial government maintained official records of approved tulip varieties, and growing an unapproved variety was apparently a finable offence. At the height of the period, Istanbul's market registered over 900 distinct named tulip varieties, each with its own documented characteristics and official valuation. The spring tulip festivals that Ahmed hosted were events of extraordinary theatrical beauty. The tortoise and lamp display I described at the beginning of this section was apparently a regular feature. Guests would arrive at dusk and walk through the illuminated gardens as the tortoises moved their gentle random paths through the flower beds, creating a constantly shifting pattern of light. Mirrors were positioned strategically to multiply the effect. The smell of roses and jasmine mixed with the night air. It sounds honestly like something from a dream, but underneath the beauty something was going wrong. The tulip period coincided with a broader Ottoman cultural shift that historians call the era of conspicuous consumption, a period in which the imperial court and the wealthy class that took its cues from the court turned increasingly inward toward luxury and entertainment, while the empire's external problems multiplied. Military campaigns were going badly. Provincial rebellions were simmering. The gap between the lives lived inside the palace walls and the lives lived in the streets of Istanbul was becoming impossible to ignore. And in 1730 it snapped. A military uprising led by a man named Patrona Halil, an Albanian-born former soldier and bathhouse worker who had become a leader of Istanbul's urban poor, turned into a full-scale revolt. The rebels marched on the palace demanding the deposition of Ahmed III and the execution of his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, the man widely blamed for the extravagances of the tulip period. Ibrahim Pasha was indeed executed. Ahmed III was forced to abdicate in favour of his nephew, and within days of the revolt the tulip gardens that had defined a decade of Ottoman court culture were torn up. Just like that. The flowers were gone. It took less than a week for the symbol of an entire era to be physically removed from the earth. There is a lesson buried in the tulip period that goes beyond the simple observation that luxury makes people angry, though it does, and that is worth noting. The deeper lesson is about the relationship between aesthetic obsession and political blindness. Ahmed III was not a cruel man by the standards of his era. He was a genuine patron of the arts. It was under his reign that the first Ottoman printing press was established, a genuinely significant modernizing development. His court produced poetry, music, and architectural work of real beauty and lasting value. The tulip period was not simply an era of waste. It was also an era of cultural flowering in the truest sense of that overused metaphor. But he was a man who had allowed the language of beauty to drown out the language of governance. When you're designing the precise angle at which oil lamps should be attached to the backs of tortoises for maximum aesthetic effect, you are perhaps not devoting sufficient attention to the wages of soldiers or the price of bread in the markets of the city below your gardens. The tulip festivals were real. The revolt was also real. Both of these things happened and neither one cancels out the other. This is something I think about when we look at almost any era of extreme aristocratic excess, the question of what was being produced alongside the luxury. The Romans built roads and aqueducts that carried water to people who had never had it. The Medici funded artists and scholars whose work endures to this day. Even the Gilded Age robber barons, for all their grotesque excesses, funded libraries, universities and concert halls that still serve the public now. The question is never simply was there beauty. The question is who paid for it, and who was left out. Ahmed III spent his final years in quiet confinement within the palace, deposed and largely forgotten. He died in 1736, 6 years after the revolution that ended his era. His tulip gardens were never restored. The tortoises, as far as history records, were simply released into the palace grounds and left to wander on their own, without their lamps, without their purpose, moving at the same patient, unhurried pace through a garden that no longer knew what it was for. I find that image strangely one of the most moving in this entire story. Now we've travelled tonight through Roman England, through Florence and Newport and Istanbul, through tunnels under English fields and palaces above the Bosphorus. We have seen what extreme wealth does when it turns outward towards spectacle and display, and what it does when it turns inward toward obsession and isolation. But there is one dimension of aristocratic excess that we have not yet fully explored, and it is perhaps the most intimate one of all, because it concerns not what the wealthy built or collected or performed for others, but what they did to their own bodies. The lengths to which royal women specifically went in pursuit of beauty, youth, and the preservation of their status, the substances they applied, the rituals they endured, the genuinely dangerous practices they submitted to in the privacy of their dressing rooms, is a chapter that combines vanity, chemistry, psychology, and more than a little tragedy. And it begins with the face. A white, powdered, immaculate, slowly poisoning face. The face of a queen so concerned with appearing ageless that she painted herself with a substance that was very quietly killing her. The face that launched 1,000 portraits was, according to the people who saw it in person, almost entirely artificial. Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, the woman who ruled one of the most powerful nations in Europe for 45 years, spent the final decades of her reign applying to her face a substance called Venetian ceruse. It was a cosmetic preparation made of white lead and vinegar mixed to a smooth paste, and it produced exactly the effect she desired, a flawlessly pale, almost luminously white complexion that projected youth, purity, and an almost supernatural composure. It was also slowly and irreversibly destroying her skin, her teeth, and her nervous system. This is the part of royal beauty history that most people have heard of in passing a vague awareness that people used to put lead on their faces. Is that not strange? But the reality, when you sit with it properly, is far more psychologically complex and far more human than the simple fact of it suggests. Because Elizabeth was not ignorant. She was one of the most educated women of her century, fluent in 6 languages, politically astute enough to outmaneuver men who'd been playing power games since before she was born. She had advisors, physicians, scholars of natural philosophy at her disposal. And the lead-based cosmetics she used were not without their critics even in the 16th century. She knew on some level what she was doing. She did it anyway. To understand why, you have to understand what the face of a monarch meant in Elizabeth's era, and specifically what it meant for Elizabeth, whose entire political identity was built on an image she had spent decades constructing with meticulous care. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, she was 25 years old, red-haired, and by contemporary accounts quite striking in an unconventional way. She was also a woman ruling in a world that assumed as its baseline that women could not and should not rule. Her legitimacy was questioned from the beginning, her personal life scrutinized in ways her male predecessors never faced, and the question of whom she would marry and thus who would actually govern England was a political obsession that followed her through the first 30 years of her reign. Elizabeth's answer to all of this was in retrospect a work of political genius. She constructed a persona the Virgin Queen married to England itself, eternally youthful, eternally untouchable, and she sustained that persona through every available means, including the management of her physical appearance with extraordinary attention to detail. By her 40s, the smallpox she had contracted in 1562 had left her face scarred and her hairline permanently damaged, which is why she began wearing her signature auburn wigs. The Venetian ceruse covered the scars and the signs of age, both producing a mask of ageless perfection that appeared in portrait after portrait throughout the later decades of her reign. And here is the thing that strikes me most about this: the portraits were not merely records, they were political instruments. Elizabeth maintained strict control over how she was depicted. Official portraits were created from approved templates and then distributed across the kingdom and to foreign courts, all of them showing the same timeless, idealized face. When an unauthorized portrait appeared that showed her looking her actual age, she had it suppressed. The face the world saw was a construction. The lead paint was just one component of a much larger architecture of image-making that was in many ways the most sophisticated PR operation of the 16th century. But the cost was real and it was cumulative. White lead, when applied to skin regularly over a period of years, is absorbed through the epidermis. It damages the nervous system, causes hair loss, erodes tooth enamel, and eventually produces a greyish discoloration of the skin, which, in what is perhaps the cruelest irony in cosmetic history, prompted heavier application of the ceruse to cover the damage the ceruse had already caused, a self-perpetuating cycle of chemical dependency that her court physicians were apparently either unable or unwilling to interrupt. The contemporary observer Thomas Tuke, writing in 1616, 15 years after Elizabeth's death, described the effects of white-lead cosmetics with grim precision, noting that they caused the skin to become rough, shrunken and discoloured over time. Several other writers of the period made similar observations. The knowledge was available. The practice continued anyway. Elizabeth died in 1603 at the age of 69, a remarkable age for her era. Whether the lead cosmetics shortened her life, or whether her robust underlying constitution simply overcame them, is impossible to determine at this distance. What is documented is that in her final years she refused to look in mirrors, that she became increasingly isolated, and that the elaborate image she had constructed over decades was by the end as much a prison as a protection. She had worn the mask for so long that she no longer knew with certainty what lay beneath it. Elizabeth was in her extreme dedication to a beauty practice that damaged her health, a particularly vivid example of something that ran through aristocratic and royal culture across many centuries and many different societies. The particular substances changed. The underlying logic that appearance was power and that power was worth almost any price remained remarkably consistent. Consider for contrast the court of Louis XIV of France, which operated on a completely different theory of beauty and status, one that was in its own way equally extreme but expressed itself through the opposite logic. Where Elizabeth used cosmetics to suggest natural perfection, the court of the Sun King used them to signal something else entirely: the ability to transform, to perform, to remake the self as theatre. Versailles under Louis XIV was a world in which the body was understood not as something to be preserved, but as something to be displayed, and the more elaborate the display, the higher the status. The men of Versailles wore heels, red-heeled shoes that Louis himself had introduced originally to make him appear taller, and which became so associated with his court that wearing red heels became a privilege restricted to those with specific royal permission. They wore towering wigs of curled white hair elaborate enough to require professional hairdressers who were considered among the most important servants in any great household. They wore face patches, small pieces of black taffeta, cut into shapes like stars or moons, and applied to the cheek or chin, which were not merely decorative but communicative. Different placements carried different social meanings that the informed observer could read at a glance, and they did not for the most part bathe. This is the detail that modern readers tend to find most startling, and I want to address it with a little more nuance than it usually receives, because the simple version, "they never bathed and just covered the smell with perfume," is not quite right, though it is not entirely wrong either. The relationship between the European aristocracy and bathing during the 17th and 18th centuries was shaped by a genuine medical belief widespread, taken seriously by physicians of the era, that bathing opened the pores of the skin and made the body vulnerable to disease and miasma. This was not simply an excuse for laziness. It was a reasoned, if incorrect, medical position held by educated people who had thought carefully about the relationship between the body and its environment. The consequence was a hygiene culture built not around washing the body, but around changing the linen. A wealthy aristocrat might change their white linen shirt multiple times a day. The clean linen was considered to perform the cleansing function that we would today assign to soap and water. The shirt absorbed the body's excretions. You changed the shirt. You were, by the logic of the era, clean. Perfume was not in this context simply covering odour. It was a medical intervention. Strong fragrances were believed to protect against disease, and the possession of elaborate, expensive perfumes was therefore simultaneously a status symbol and a health practice. Louis XIV reportedly had a different perfume applied to his apartments each day of the week. He had a dedicated court perfumer, whose sole responsibility was the management of the royal scent. The floral gardens of Versailles were planted partly for their aesthetic beauty, and partly to supply the raw materials for the perfume production that kept the court functioning by its own internal logic. When you set that beside Elizabeth I's lead paint and the bezoar stones of the Medici, all of them expensive, all of them believed to be genuinely efficacious, all of them products of a medical understanding we now know to have been fundamentally wrong, a pattern becomes visible that I find both humbling and oddly comforting. The wealthy of every era spend enormous resources on the most advanced health and beauty practices available to them. The practices are wrong. They are always wrong because every era's medicine is primitive by the standards of the era that follows it. And the enormous resources simply mean that the wealthy are wrong in more elaborate, more expensive, and sometimes more damaging ways than everyone else. There is one more figure from this particular chapter of history who deserves a moment, because her story is simultaneously the most dramatic and the most disputed of the royal beauty obsessions we have touched on tonight. Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian noblewoman of the late 16th century, is known to legend as the woman who bathed in the blood of young women in the belief that it would preserve her youth. This story has been repeated for 400 years and has spawned more Gothic literature than almost any other historical figure. The historical reality is considerably more complicated. Bathory was tried and convicted in 1611 of the torture and killing of young women servants, crimes that were real and extensively documented by witnesses. Whether she actually believed in the cosmetic properties of blood, or whether the blood-bathing legend was a later embellishment added to an already horrifying story, is a question that historians still debate. The testimony at her trial does not include the blood-bathing claim as a central element, and some scholars have argued that the legend grew in the century after her death, possibly for political reasons related to the confiscation of her estates. What is not disputed is that she was extraordinarily wealthy, extraordinarily powerful, and that she used both with a cruelty that her position made for a time almost unaccountable. The Bathory case sits at the darkest possible extreme of a spectrum we've been exploring all evening, a spectrum that begins with the merely peculiar and ends in its worst expressions in genuine harm. Most of what we've discussed tonight sits in the complicated, middle-strange, wasteful, sometimes revealing of deep human longings, occasionally self-destructive but ultimately harmless to others. Bathory is the reminder that this particular chapter of history has a dark edge, and that it is worth acknowledging honestly before we move on. The obsession with youth beauty and the preservation of status through appearance is of course not an exclusively aristocratic preoccupation, nor an exclusively historical one. Every era has its Venetian cirrus, its expensive, culturally endorsed practice that future generations will regard with the same mixture of sympathy and disbelief. But the next chapter of our journey takes us somewhere unexpected away from the courts and drawing rooms we've been visiting, and into the hushed, tatami-floored world of Japanese feudal power. Because while European royalty was painting their faces with lead and debating the proper placement of beauty patches, Japan's most powerful warlords were fighting wars over a cup of tea. Literally. A single ceramic tea bowl held in the hands of a man who was in that moment the most feared military commander in Japan could be worth more than an entire province. And the story of how a simple ritual became the most dangerous game in feudal Japanese politics is one of the most fascinating things I've ever discovered in the course of trying to understand what wealth actually does to people when given enough time and enough power to work with. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in a Japanese tea room that you cannot find anywhere else in the world. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of absolute attention, of four walls, a low doorway, a single hanging scroll, a flower in a narrow vase, and two human beings moving through a ritual that has been refined over 5 centuries until every gesture carries exactly the weight it is meant to carry and nothing more. The tea room is by design the great equalizer. Its doorway, called the Nijiriguchi, is so low that everyone who enters must bow deeply regardless of their rank. A general and a monk enter the same way. A warlord and a farmer bow the same bow, unless of course the warlord has spent the equivalent of a modern fortune acquiring the bowl being used for the ceremony, in which case the general understanding in the room is that the equalization is rather more theoretical than actual. Welcome to the world of Japanese Chado, the way of tea, and to one of the most extraordinary stories of how a simple ritual became in the hands of Japan's most powerful men one of the most sophisticated and dangerous instruments of political control ever devised. The history of tea ceremony in Japan stretches back to the 9th century, when Buddhist monks returning from Tang Dynasty China brought tea back with them as an aid to meditation. For several centuries it remained primarily a monastic practice, a way of maintaining alertness during long periods of seated contemplation. What transformed it into something vastly more complex was the attention of the warrior class. By the 15th century, powerful samurai lords, the daimyo who controlled Japan's fragmented feudal landscape, had begun collecting the ceramic utensils used in the tea ceremony, with an intensity that can only be described as obsessive. And by the time Japan's unification wars reached their peak in the late 16th century, the tea ceremony had become something that no one who lived through it would have predicted from its monastic origins a weapon. The man most responsible for this transformation was Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who, beginning in the 1560s, launched the military campaigns that would eventually unify Japan after a century of chaos. Nobunaga was a man of extraordinary energy and ruthlessness, a military innovator who changed the nature of Japanese warfare by deploying massed firearms against cavalry, and a personality of such force that the records of his own retainers suggest even his allies found him genuinely terrifying. He was also unexpectedly one of the great connoisseurs of tea utensils in Japanese history. Nobunaga's approach to teaware was unlike anything that had preceded it, and it reshaped the cultural landscape of Japan in ways that outlasted his military conquests by centuries. He called his policy Miwu Shuri, roughly translated as the hunting of famous objects, and it was precisely what it sounds like. He systematically identified the most celebrated tea utensils in Japan: bowls, caddies, water containers, bamboo scoops, and acquired them by purchase when possible, by confiscation when not. These objects already had names and histories and reputations built up over generations of careful ownership. A tea bowl called Hatsuhana, a caddy called Narashiba, a water jar that had passed through the hands of successive shoguns. Each one carried with it a chain of provenance, a story of who had owned it, who had used it, in whose presence, what moment of history it had witnessed. And Nobunaga understood, with the instincts of a political genius, that controlling these objects meant controlling that history, that owning the most celebrated tea utensils in Japan meant owning a piece of Japan's cultural identity itself. He then weaponized that understanding by making the right to hold a tea ceremony, using his objects in his presence, something that had to be earned. His retainers could not simply host a gathering. They had to receive his permission, and that permission was granted in exchange for loyalty, military service, and political compliance. The tea ceremony in Nobunaga's hands became a reward system, a mechanism for demonstrating hierarchy and reinforcing obligation that was in many ways more effective than simply paying people, because money could be spent and forgotten. But the honor of having hosted a tea ceremony using Nobunaga's Hatsuhana bowl, that was something a man carried for the rest of his life, something his descendants would speak of, something that bound him to Nobunaga's legacy in a way that no financial transaction could replicate. After Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, his system of tea as political theatre was inherited and refined by his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who took it to heights that still astonish historians today. Hideyoshi came from the very bottom of the social order. Born to a peasant farmer, he had risen through military ability and extraordinary personal charisma to become the most powerful man in Japan, the Taiko, the regent, the man who completed the unification that Nobunaga had begun. His rise was so improbable that he spent much of his career dealing with the legitimacy problem that no amount of military success could entirely solve. He was not of noble birth, and in a society that placed enormous weight on lineage, that fact never fully went away. Tea ceremony became, among other things, his answer to that problem. In 1587, Hideyoshi organized what historians call the Kitano Tenmangu Tea Gathering, an event so ambitious in its conception that it stands as perhaps the single most extraordinary tea ceremony event in history. He issued a public announcement distributed across the entire country, inviting every person in Japan from the highest daimyo to the lowest farmer to attend a massive outdoor tea ceremony in the pine grove of the Kitano Shrine in Kyoto. The announcement specified that everyone was welcome regardless of rank, that Hideyoshi himself would be present and would participate, that any tea bowl and any equipment would be acceptable, even a simple wooden bowl was fine, that the gathering would last 10 days. The intent was transparent and brilliant. By inviting everyone in the country to share tea with him, Hideyoshi was performing a kind of democratic legitimacy that his birth could not provide. He was saying, "I am not a noble lord elevated above the common people. I am the man who brings all of Japan together around a single bowl." He cancelled the gathering after the first day for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, possibly due to political concerns, possibly simply because the logistics of managing an open invitation to the entire population of Japan had proven more complicated than anticipated. But the announcement alone had accomplished its purpose. The image had been projected. The most famous figure in all of Japanese tea history is not Nobunaga or Hideyoshi, however. It is the man who served both of them as tea master Sen no Rikyu. Sen no Rikyu is, in the world of Japanese aesthetics, a figure of almost mythological importance. He is credited with formulating wabi-cha, the aesthetic philosophy of rustic simplicity that defines Japanese tea ceremony to this day. Where earlier tea culture had favoured elaborate Chinese ceramic masterpieces, Rikyū championed irregular, unassuming pieces made by Japanese craftsmen, rough-surfaced bowls, dark glazes, asymmetrical forms that required attention and contemplation to appreciate. He believed that the highest form of beauty was not perfection, but presence, the quality of being completely honestly oneself, without adornment or pretense. A cracked tea bowl repaired with gold lacquer, a technique called kintsugi, which you may have heard of, was not inferior to an uncracked one. The repair was part of the object's story, and the story was part of the beauty. The philosophy was genuinely radical, and it made Rikyū, who was implementing it in the presence of the most powerful military leader in Japan, extraordinarily influential and extraordinarily dangerous. By the late 1580s, Rikyū's influence over Hideyoshi had grown to a degree that made the warlord's other advisors deeply uncomfortable. He had opinions not just on tea, but on architecture, on art, on the design of Hideyoshi's residences. He had a network of students among the most powerful daimyo in Japan. He controlled in effect the cultural conversation of the country's ruling class. In 1591, Hideyoshi ordered Rikyū to perform ritual suicide. The reasons have been debated for 4 centuries. Some accounts suggest a personal insult. A wooden statue of Rikyū had been placed atop a gate at one of his temples, and Hideyoshi interpreted this as forcing him to walk beneath Rikyū's feet. Others suggest political maneuvering by Rikyū's enemies at court. Some historians believe Rikyū had become simply too powerful, too central, too impossible to ignore, and that Hideyoshi, who trusted no one in the end, decided that the influence of a tea master over the culture of his court was a threat he could not afford to leave unaddressed. Rikyū accepted the order with composure. He performed one final tea ceremony for his closest students, then composed a death poem and fulfilled the order. He was 70 years old. The story of Senno Rikyū is, among other things, the story of what happens when aesthetic expertise becomes political power, and of the particular danger that faces anyone who achieves genuine cultural authority in a world where military authority is absolute. Can you think of another figure in history who was simultaneously the most admired cultural advisor to the most powerful man in the country, and who was destroyed precisely because that admiration gave him too much leverage? It is not a common story, but it is a deeply revealing one. Because Rikyū's execution tells us something important about the relationship between wealth, power, and culture that we've been circling around throughout our entire journey tonight. Culture, aesthetic sensibility. The ability to define what is beautiful and what is not is a form of power. In some eras and some social systems, it can be the most durable form of power there is. It outlasts armies. It outlasts fortunes. Rikyū has been dead for over 400 years. His aesthetic philosophy is still the foundation of one of the most practiced traditional arts in Japan. Hideyoshi's empire lasted 11 years after Rikyū's death before collapsing into civil war. The tea bowls themselves, those humble, irregular, impossibly expensive objects that men fought over and died for, many of them still exist. They sit in museums and private collections and temple treasuries across Japan, handled now only with white cotton gloves displayed under controlled light and humidity. Each one still carrying its name, its history, its chain of provenance. A chawan that once rested in the hands of Oda Nobunaga, a caddy that Hideyoshi pressed his own fingers against, considering it turning it slowly in the light. Objects that were worth more than provinces, that carried the weight of political obligation and aesthetic philosophy and human ambition all at once, in their rough, asymmetrical surfaces. There is something very quiet about them in photographs, something that seems entirely indifferent to the human drama that accumulated around them, which is perhaps exactly as it should be. We have spent this journey moving through extraordinary expressions of wealth, the theatrical, the obsessive, the beautiful, the self-destructive, the philosophically searching. We have been to Rome and England, Florence and Newport, Istanbul, and the tea rooms of feudal Japan. There is one more place we need to visit before our journey's complete. Not a historical place exactly, but a place that connects everything we have discovered tonight to the world you and I actually live in. Because the habits we've been exploring did not end with the feudal lords or the Victorian aristocrats or the Ottoman sultans. They simply put on a different set of clothes and walked into the 21st century. And some of what the world's wealthiest people are doing right now, the habits, the obsessions, the architectural expressions of extreme wealth, would have been entirely recognizable to every person we've met tonight. The last chapter of our story is the one happening in real time, and it might be the strangest of all. What would you do if you had more money than you could possibly spend and someone offered to sell you a giraffe? Not a ticket to see a giraffe, not a photograph of one, the actual animal, yours to own, to feed, to walk through your gardens on a leash, to introduce to dinner guests as casually as you might introduce a new painting you had acquired from Florence. For the Roman aristocracy at the height of the Republic and early Empire, this was not a hypothetical question. It was a purchasing decision. And the appetite for exotic animals among Rome's wealthiest citizens was so intense, so competitive, and so genuinely strange that it reshaped the ecology of 3 continents across the span of several centuries. We touched briefly on Lucullus and his celebrated fish ponds in our first chapter tonight, but that was merely the tip of a very large, very unusual iceberg. The Roman elite's relationship with wild animals goes so much deeper and gets so much more revealing about the psychology of extreme wealth that it deserves its own moment in our journey. The Romans called their private collections of exotic animals vivaria living collections, and among the aristocratic class of the late Republic owning one was not merely fashionable, but politically significant. The animals you kept, the rarity and danger of them, the scale of the enclosure you built for them communicated your reach, your connections, your access to the far edges of the known world. Consider what it actually required to own an elephant in Rome in the 1st century BC. You needed contacts in North Africa or India who could arrange the capture and transportation of a wild animal weighing several tons across sea routes that were at best unreliable. You needed ships large enough to carry it. You needed handlers experienced enough to keep it alive during a months-long voyage. You needed an enclosure substantial enough to house it properly when it arrived. And then you needed a supply chain capable of providing the quantities of vegetation an elephant requires on a daily basis, quantities that in the Italian climate were not trivial to source. Every elephant in a Roman aristocrat's garden represented a network of trade routes, shipping connections and logistical arrangements that stretched from the Italian peninsula to the furthest edges of the empire and beyond. The animal itself was proof made flesh that its owner could project wealth and influence across that entire distance. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the same Crassus who wept over his pet lamprey, reportedly kept lions that he had trained to some degree to be handled by his household staff. Julius Caesar, whose ambitions ran somewhat larger than the domestic, brought back giraffes from his African campaigns and displayed them in Rome, the first giraffes most Romans had ever seen. The crowds, by all accounts, were extraordinary. People came from across Italy to see the creatures that looked as Pliny the Elder later described them like camels wearing leopard coats. But the private collections of even the wealthier senators were modest compared to what the emperors eventually assembled. Augustus, the first emperor, the man who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, while carefully maintaining the appearance of republican institutions, built what ancient sources describe as the most extensive collection of exotic animals ever assembled in the ancient world. His vivaria contained animals from Britain, Ethiopia, India, and the regions beyond the Caspian Sea. He presented rhinoceroses, tigers, and snakes of extraordinary size to the Roman public in dedicated display events. He received a delegation from India that brought with them as diplomatic gifts a man who had been born without arms and had learned to use his feet to shoot arrows and play musical instruments, along with tigers, a python, and a partridge of enormous size. The combination of diplomatic gift-giving and exotic animal display was in the Roman world deeply intentional. To receive rare animals from distant kings was to demonstrate that those kings acknowledged your supremacy. To display them publicly was to share that supremacy with the Roman people, or at least to perform sharing it, which in the theatre of Roman political life amounted to much the same thing. What strikes me about this every time I sit with it is the sheer scale of ecological disruption that the Roman appetite for exotic animals produced. Modern historians and environmental researchers have traced what appears to be a genuine population collapse of several large animal species in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia directly to Roman demand. The hippopotamus, once abundant along the entire length of the Nile, was pushed out of northern Egypt entirely by Roman hunting and capture operations. The North African elephant, a distinct subspecies from the African bush elephant, was hunted to extinction, with Roman demand for ivory and live animals playing a significant role. The lion population of the Middle East, which had been substantial at the beginning of the Roman period, declined dramatically over the centuries of Roman rule as tens of thousands of animals were captured or killed for public spectacles and private collections. The last wild lions in Greece had disappeared by approximately 100 AD. Wealth expressed through the desire to possess and display the rarest things in the world left its mark not just on human history, but on the natural world itself. This is something that takes a moment to absorb properly. The Roman aristocrats building their private menageries 2,000 years ago were not thinking about ecological consequences. That framework of understanding simply did not exist yet. But the consequences were real regardless. The private menagerie tradition continued through medieval Europe, where wealthy monarchs maintained what they called beast gardens, early predecessors of the modern zoo. The Tower of London housed a royal menagerie from approximately 1204, when King John received 3 leopards as a diplomatic gift, until 1835. For over 6 centuries, wild animals lived in the centre of one of England's most important fortresses, fed on the meat surplus from the royal kitchens, occasionally escaping into the surrounding city to the considerable alarm of the inhabitants. In 1252, Henry III received a polar bear as a gift from the King of Norway. The Tower of London apparently did not have an easy solution for housing a polar bear, and the compromise they arrived at was to put it on a long chain and allow it to fish in the Thames, which is one of those historical details that I find so perfectly absurdly British that I cannot help smiling every time I encounter it. A polar bear, on a chain, fishing in the Thames, in medieval London. The medieval monarchs who maintained these collections were doing in a different vocabulary and a different century exactly what the Roman aristocrats had done before them. They were using living creatures from the edges of the world as instruments of prestige, proof of connections, symbols of power that reached beyond the ordinary. A polar bear fishing in your river said to anyone who could see it, "I have friends in Norway. I have the resources to transport an Arctic animal across the North Sea. I am a person whose reach extends to places you have never been." The private menagerie as a pure status symbol reached its apex arguably in 18th century Europe, and nowhere more elaborately than in the collections maintained by the great aristocratic houses of Britain, France, and Germany. Estates that had already hired ornamental hermits and built Gothic follies began adding animal collections that combined the theatrical, the scientific, and the competitive in roughly equal measure. The Duke of Richmond maintained a collection at Goodwood in Sussex that included kangaroos, bears, and a variety of African antelope all living in conditions that were considered quite progressive for the era. The 4th Duke of Bedford kept a menagerie at Woburn Abbey that included zebras, elands, and various deer species, and which contributed genuine specimens to the natural history collections of the period. These aristocratic collections were not simply idle vanity. Many of them served as genuine repositories of natural history knowledge, at a time when systematic biology was only just emerging as a discipline. The animals in private collections were observed drawn and documented by naturalists who had no other access to such specimens. Darwin's own thinking was influenced at least indirectly by the observations made possible by the availability of exotic animals in private English collections. The road from a Roman senator's lion to the origin of species is a long and winding one, but it is not entirely without continuity. And yet, and I think this matters, the animals in all of these collections, from the vivaria of Rome to the beast gardens of medieval London, to the aristocratic menageries of Georgian England, were living creatures pulled from their natural environments and placed in conditions that served human purposes rather than their own. The polar bear fishing in the Thames was not there by choice. The giraffe walking through a Roman senator's garden was not living the life it was built for. This is not a reason to dismiss the historical significance of these collections, or to deny the genuine scientific value some of them produced, but it is a dimension worth holding alongside the other dimensions, the same honest complexity we brought to the mummy unwrapping parties, to the Bathory story, to the ecological impact of Roman appetites. History is rarely simple, and the habits of the wealthy across every century we have visited tonight are perhaps least simple of all. We are almost at the end of our journey. We have crossed so much ground together, so many centuries, so many countries, so many extraordinary expressions of what human beings do when they have more resources than the ordinary world requires of them. There is one final stop. And it is in many ways the most important because it is the stop that connects everything. The stop where we lift our heads from the past and look directly at the present and ask the question that has been quietly building underneath everything we've discussed tonight. What does it all mean? What does the long, strange history of wealthy eccentricity tell us about human nature itself? Not just about Caligula or the Duke of Portland or Sultan Ahmed, but about all of us, and about what we are really searching for when we reach beyond what we need into the territory of what we desire. The final chapter brings us home, and I think it may surprise you. Here we are, the last chapter. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from the fish ponds of ancient Rome to the tulip gardens of Istanbul, from the secret rooms of Florence to the tunnels beneath Nottinghamshire, from the drawing rooms of Newport to the tea rooms of feudal Japan. We have met emperors and eccentrics, hermits and warlords, queens and socialites, each of them expressing through the particular vocabulary of their era this same restless, searching, relentlessly human impulse. And now I want to bring us home, to the world that exists right now outside whatever window is nearest to you. Because the habits did not end. They never end, they simply evolve. In 2021, a super yacht called Amadea was photographed in a port in Fiji. It measured over 106 meters in length, contained a helicopter landing pad, a pool, a cinema, multiple dining rooms and crew quarters for 50 people. The price tag was reported at around $300 million. What made Amadea slightly unusual among the super yachts of the ultra-wealthy was not its size. It was the fact that its owner also possessed a support vessel, a second, somewhat smaller yacht whose primary purpose was to carry the toy's equipment and additional supplies that could not fit on the main yacht. A yacht to support the yacht. If that sentence made you pause for a moment, you're having the exact same reaction that every person throughout this entire story has had when confronted with the logical endpoint of extreme wealth. There is always a moment where the sheer scale of the thing tips over from impressive into something else, something almost philosophical. What does it mean to need a second yacht to support your primary yacht? What inner experience produces that specific arrangement of resources? The answer, I think, is the same answer that explains Caligula's bridge, Lucullus's mountain canal, Ahmed III's tortoise lamps, and the Duke of Portland's 15 miles of underground passages. When the ordinary world has been exhausted, when every conventional expression of comfort and status has been achieved, the only direction left is further, always further, more remote, more particular, more specifically shaped to the contours of one inner life. The modern expressions of extreme wealth are in many ways the most transparent versions of this pattern we have encountered in our entire journey, simply because we have more information about them, and because they are happening in real time rather than being filtered through centuries of historical distance. Howard Hughes, the American aviation pioneer, filmmaker, and business magnate, who was at various points in the mid-20th century the wealthiest private individual in the United States, developed in his later years a set of habits that would have been immediately recognizable to the 5th Duke of Portland. Hughes became, from approximately the late 1950s onward, profoundly reclusive. He communicated primarily through written notes. He refused to be photographed. He lived for extended periods in hotel penthouses that he had sealed to his own specifications, windows covered controlled lighting, specific requirements for how objects could be arranged and handled. He had an intense phobia of contamination and developed elaborate protocols for the handling of everyday items, requiring that objects be wrapped in multiple layers of tissue paper before he would touch them, and that anyone who needed to interact with him follow procedures designed to minimize the transmission of any microbes. He spent his final years living in a darkened room, watching the same films repeatedly served by a small circle of aides who had adapted entirely to his requirements. He weighed less than 90 pounds when he died in 1976 aboard a private jet flying him to a hospital, where it was hoped he might receive treatment. The wealth in the end had not protected him from the thing he feared most. It had simply given him the resources to build an increasingly elaborate architecture around that fear, one that over time became indistinguishable from a prison. I think about the Duke of Portland when I think about Hughes. Two men a century apart, both possessed of extraordinary wealth, both unable to tolerate the ordinary world pressing against them, both retreating one underground, one into a sealed and darkened room in search of a version of existence that the world as it was could not provide. The tunnels were different. The psychology was the same. The modern billionaire class has added some genuinely new chapters to the history of wealthy eccentricity, though. Chapters that the historical figures we have met tonight would have found, depending on their temperament, either inspiring or entirely baffling. The pursuit of immortality, which we explored through the lens of Qin Shi Huang and the Tang dynasty emperors, has returned in the 21st century with extraordinary financial backing and a vocabulary borrowed from biology and technology, rather than Taoist alchemy. Companies with names like Calico, funded substantially by Google and Unity Biotechnology and Altos Labs, have received hundreds of millions of dollars in investment from technology billionaires pursuing what is at its core the exact same goal that Qin Shi Huang dispatched Xu Fu to find a way to stop the biological clock. The approaches are of course genuinely different. Gene therapy, senolytics, telomere research, the study of longevity in organisms like naked mole rats and Greenland sharks that live for centuries, this is real science conducted by serious researchers. The mercury pills are gone, but the hunger underneath it, the specific trembling billion-dollar hunger of a man who controls almost everything and cannot accept that one limit is recognizable across 2,000 years without any translation required. What I find genuinely interesting about this parallel is not the cynical version of it, not the easy observation that rich people have always wanted to live forever. Is that not sad? What I find interesting is what it tells us about the relationship between capability and desire. These men are funding research that, if it succeeds, will benefit everyone. The longevity science emerging from Silicon Valley investment may eventually produce treatments that extend healthy human life across the entire population. The Emperor Qin's search for immortality produced no such spillover benefit, but the Medici's search for wonder produced the foundations of modern natural history museums. Extreme wealth expressed through obsessive personal preoccupation has a complicated relationship with the broader good. Sometimes the eccentricity is merely wasteful. Sometimes it accidentally produces something that changes the world. Then there is the most contemporary of all expressions, the one that I think would have produced the most genuine bewilderment in the people we have met tonight, because it represents a kind of wealth behavior that has no real historical precedent. The space race of the 21st century. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson have each poured billions of their personal fortunes into private spaceflight companies, Blue Origin, SpaceX, and Virgin Galactic respectively. The stated goals are various tourism, colonization of Mars, the long-term survival of the human species beyond Earth. The personal motivations are as layered and complex as the men themselves, and probably not fully transparent even to them. But consider the gesture from the outside for a moment. A man who has accumulated more wealth than any individual in the recorded history of the United States decides as a primary personal project to build rockets that leave the planet, not to explore what is on the other side of the mountain or the other side of the ocean or even the other side of the world, to leave the world itself behind. If Caligula's bridge across the Bay of Baiae was a gesture toward transcendence, toward the demonstration that the ordinary limits of geography did not apply to him, then Bezos's Blue Origin rocket is stripped of its technical complexity, the same gesture made 2,000 years later against a larger backdrop. The sea has been conquered, the land has been mapped, the air has been tamed. The only limit left, the only frontier grand enough to contain the ambition is the sky itself. And the sky in the 21st century is where the very wealthy have chosen to go. I want to offer you one more thought before we close, because it is the one that has stayed with me most through the years of reading and researching and sitting with all of these stories. Every person we have met tonight, every Roman senator weeping over a dead fish, every Georgian landowner installing a silent man in his garden, every alchemist emperor swallowing something that would kill him, every warlord paying a fortune for an asymmetrical tea bowl was doing something recognizable if we are honest with ourselves. They were trying to feel something, not just pleasure, though pleasure was part of it, not just power, though power was certainly present. They were reaching each in their own strange and particular way for the experience of being fully alive in a world that seemed to recede from them as their wealth increased. The more insulated you are from the ordinary frictions and necessities of existence, the cold, the hunger, the need to persuade others, the requirement of being useful, the further away the world begins to feel. And when the world feels far away, human beings do extraordinary things to close the distance. Some build tunnels, some dissolve pearls in vinegar, some install silent men in stone huts and watch them from their windows searching for a wisdom they cannot quite name. Some send fleets across unknown seas looking for something they have decided to call immortality. And some of us, most of us, in the ordinary lives we lead without dynasties or estates or super yachts, find our own smaller versions of the same reaching. The object we save up for that we cannot quite justify. The trip we take to a place we cannot explain the pull of. The book we read at midnight when we should be sleeping because something in us needs to know what happened next. That reaching is not a flaw. It is the most human thing about us. What history teaches us, if we read it carefully and honestly, is that wealth amplifies. It does not transform. It takes whatever is already there, the curiosity, the hunger, the loneliness, the creativity, the fear, and gives it resources and time and scale. The things that emerge can be beautiful or destructive or absurd or all three at once. But they are always underneath the marble and the gold and the rocket fuel recognizably human. The Duke of Portland just wanted to be left alone. The Medici just wanted to understand a world that felt vast and mysterious. Ahmed III just wanted one more spring of perfect beauty. Senno Rikyu just wanted people to pay attention. Really, pay attention to the quality of a moment. These are not strange desires. They are in fact desires that most of us carry quietly through our ordinary days, the wish for solitude, for wonder, for beauty, for presence. The difference is that they had the money to act on them at extraordinary scale, and that scale made them legendary, peculiar, and in some cases dangerous. But it did not make them alien. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. We have covered 12 chapters and more than 2,000 years of human history, and I hope it has given you something to think about, or perhaps if you are listening at the right time of day, something to drift quietly away from into sleep with. If this journey meant something to you, if one of these stories made you pause and look at your own world a little differently, then it has done exactly what I hoped it would. There is a comment waiting for you below if you feel like leaving one. I read every single one, and there is nothing I love more than hearing which of these strange, extraordinary, entirely real human beings caught your attention and would not quite let go. The history of what wealth does to people is long and layered and endlessly surprising, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. The next story we tell together will take us somewhere completely different, into a world that is equally strange, equally human, and equally impossible to look away from once you have started. I will see you there. Sleep well,